Hello and welcome to all here tonight. I'm delighted to welcome so many of you to this training on the board as a corporate entity. A particular welcome to Anne Fay, who is joining us here tonight, and Anne is chairperson of the CPSMA. This module, the board as a corporate entity, is possibly the most important of a number of training modules available to board members, as it helps each board member become familiar with the functions and responsibilities of being a board member, as well as making each member aware of the different roles on the board. I would like to thank chairpersons and principals who made you aware of this training and encouraged you to attend. Indeed, many chairpersons and principals are joining us for the training, and thank you. The new Board of Management came into being in December 2019. Training was planned for all board members in early 2020. Unfortunately, this did not happen, and COVID came along and upset any plans we had for rolling out the training. We did get to arranging one face-to-face deanery meeting in February 2020. We also have had Zoom deanery meetings in autumn 2020 and in spring 2021. However, these are primarily for chairpersons and principals. Noreen Lawler delivered training for chairpersons in December 2019. And speaking of Noreen, I'm delighted to welcome her again to Cork. Very welcome, Noreen.
Thanks,
Noreen is training manager with CPSMA, and with Noreen this evening is Miriam McCabe. And Miriam is also welcome to Cork. You'll have to come down some stage with Noreen and face-to-face meet our board members here in Cork.
I'd be delighted.
Both Noreen and Miriam are well known as to chairpersons and principals for all the help and support they offer. They are both experienced principals and board members themselves. Also, being at the end of the phone at CPSMA Maynooth, they're very aware of issues that do arise from time to time in our schools. They are best placed to advise us on management. And for those of you not familiar with the CPSMA, CPSMA is the Catholic Primary Schools Management Association. And this is the management body for all primary schools under Catholic patronage. So without further delay, I hand you over to both Noreen and Miriam.
That's great, Dan. Thank you very much. And again, thanks for the warm virtual welcome to Cork. We always get a great welcome to Cork. And look, we'll look forward to a time when we can meet you all face to face again. But look, Miriam and myself are delighted to be with you tonight. You've done a great introduction, so I won't go into too much more on it, just to say thanks to all of the attendees for submitting questions in advance of tonight's webinar. As you said, Dan, the board as a corporate entity is the most important one really for boards of management. It's quite a lengthy one. And what we've tried to do is, I suppose, first of all, because there's so much in it, we pared it back as much as we could for the virtual experience, because we're very mindful of Zoom fatigue. But what we're going to do throughout the webinar is we're going to reference resources. Again, all the training in terms of a blended approach has changed quite a bit in the last 12 months. So what we're doing is we're making as many resources available offline so that you can look at them in your own time, and then we'll supplement them with these virtual live events. So don't worry about missing a reference to any document or any circular or anything at all. Miriam and myself will put that together for you in one document, and we're going to send it out to you after the webinar has finished. So in relation to the other resources, we'll start off with this one, because this really is your primary resource. It's your go-to document as a Board of Management member. And as Dan set out in relation to the term of office of the board, this is the 2019 to 2023. The published document, you should have got a copy of it. It may be the case that you didn't, but you can get it online. We'll include a link to that as well. The published version has both Irish and English. And if you want to look at the English version only, there's 65 pages in it. So it's well worth your while to download it and become familiar with the provisions of it. Because when you signed up as a member of the Board of Management in December 2019, you signed a declaration of acceptance of membership of the school's board. And in that, you agreed to undertake to adhere to the provisions of this governance manual and relevant legislation and policy and department circulars. So, you know, it is part of the governance. It's the overarching manual really for board members. So again, we made a reference to a number of webinars that we have recorded, and they're on our website and in relation to the board as a corporate entity. The first one is Board of Management Functions and Responsibilities. The second one relates to roles and responsibilities. That's the individual roles of officers and members of the board. And the third webinar relates to the delivery of Board of Management meetings and managing Board of Management meetings. So we have those three recorded webinars. Now we are going to make reference to them, and we're going to dip in and out of the content as we go along tonight. But you can look at them in greater detail. There's much greater detail in all of those. I think just to mention, I can't see the chat at the moment, but just in case you're wondering, we are going to record this webinar, and Dan will have it available on the Cloyne CPSMA website. So moving along, I like this slide. I think I incorporate it in every training event, because it's to give you an idea of where the Board of Management sits in terms of governance. It's not that you're there in a vacuum. It's to show you, you know, where your role derives from and your responsibilities. So the Education Act of '98 is, I suppose, the key piece of legislation that governs the provision of education of every person in the state, including any person with a disability or who has other special educational needs. So that's what the Education Act says. And it sets out the functions and responsibilities of all the key partners in education, well, in the schooling system, and that includes the functions of the Board of Management. So there's a raft of other legislation that you'll probably be familiar with if you think of even recent legislation in relation to admissions, health and safety, employment legislation, data protection, child protection, and that's to name just a few. So that's where that's what boards really have to be mindful of. So out of the legislation, the Minister for Education and Skills, I suppose we'll call her the Minister for Education now, they've changed their title. So if I refer to skills inadvertently, apologies. So it's up then to the Minister for Education to set out policy through legislation and circular letters. So any of the circulars, well, the majority of the circulars that you would get would be based on legislation and policy that's agreed by the department. And then the responsibility for implementing all of those policies and for ensuring that legislation is supported and implemented, that comes down to the Board of Management. So the Board of Management also acts on behalf of the patron to ensure that it carries out its statutory obligations under Section 15 of the Education Act. And that's the part of the Education Act that sets out the functions of the board. We're going to look at that shortly. So in the case of Catholic schools in the Diocese of Cloyne, your patron is Bishop Crean. So you operate or you manage your school on behalf of the patron. So the board manages the school on behalf of the patron and is accountable to the patron and to the minister. Then the principal is responsible for the day-to-day management of the school, including the guidance and direction of the teachers and other staff. And the principal is also responsible for the implementation of the policies that are agreed by the board, and then the policies will flow from ministerial instruction and the wishes of the patron. So that's the role of the principal, to implement the wishes and the policies of the board on a day-to-day basis. And the principal is accountable to the board for doing that. So that's why at every board of management meeting, you have the principal's report. So it's a two-way system. The principal is accountable to the board for implementing the policies. And then the board of management is accountable again to the minister. And there are inspections, so that the inspections by members of the inspectorate is where the minister has oversight on the operation of the board. And also the board is accountable to the patron. So copies of any inspection that's carried out by the inspectorate will also be sent to the patron. So you can see where it all sits in that overview. So let's have a look at the overarching duty of the board. And I think this is the key message from the Education Act, and this is what should be at the fore in all of your work as board members. It shall be the duty of a board to manage the school on behalf of the patron and for the benefit of the students and their parents, and to provide or cause to be provided an appropriate education for each student at the school for which that board has responsibility. So that's the key function of the board of management, and the pupil is at the centre of all of that. Now, there are other responsibilities that are set out, and we're going to look at them during the course of the presentation rather than going into each one of them in detail. This would include obligations in respect of maintaining the Catholic ethos of the school, the efficient use of resources, and that would be around the efficient use of grant aid, etc., and the board's responsibility in respect of accounts. So there's a number of different obligations that are set out in the Education Act, but this is the key one. Now, I know that one of your questions that you submitted in advance was around the role of the board in relation to employment and promotion. So just to be clear about it, the board is the employer of all staff in the school. So even though payment might be made by the department for the teachers and the SNAs, they're paid directly by the department, the contract of employment is with the board of management. And with that, of course, comes all of the responsibilities of an employer in terms of department circulars, which set out the terms and conditions of employees, in terms of health and safety, all of those responsibilities that an employer has. So the board is the employer of all in the school. Again, other salaries that aren't paid directly by the department, they would be paid from grants that are issued by the department for that specific purpose. So we say the secretary and the caretaker, and Miriam is going to go, we'll have a look at those particular grants in her section of the presentation. So even though the board is the employer, and I think this may be where the question was coming from, the one that was sent in to us in advance, the responsibility for the recruitment process devolves to the interview board. So that's a specific task that's given to the interview board, and they go through the process, and that responsibility is given to them by the board. So the patron also has a role in at the outset of the process, in that at the start of the process, he appoints an independent assessor to the interview board. So whenever there's an appointment of a principal or deputy principal through external process, a teacher or an SNA, you need to contact Dan to get an independent assessor for that process. So you can see the patron is involved at the outset. And then at the end of the recruitment process, after the board of management has sanctioned the outcome of the interview process, the successful candidate can't be appointed until the formal approval of the patron is received. So the patron has input at the start, the patron has input at the end of the process. In the middle, it's the interview board that manages the process on behalf of the board of management. So when it comes to the sanction of the post, the board of management will sanction the post. the interview board report will go to the board, and they will sanction the post unless there's a good and sufficient reason for not doing so, and that's covered in the processes. And just to be reminded of that the processes for recruiting teachers and SNAs, they're statutory procedures and they have to be adhered to. So it's important, I suppose, if we ask what is my role on the Board of Management. So it's important to be clear that although the board members come to the board by different routes, and you'll have gone down those routes before December 1st, 2019. So nominated by parents, nominated by teachers, the patron or the wider community. They do not sit on the board to advance the interests of any particular group. Now, we may repeat that a number of times throughout the presentation, but there's no harm in repeating it because it really is important. So the members of the board form a corporate group with a particular purpose and commitment. And even if nominated by a particular group, members of the board are not representing that group, nor are they delegates of their electorate, but they act in the interests of the whole school community. And we'll mention that a couple of times, you know, that the word representative, it was there maybe, I think they changed it about 8 years ago. It was representative at that point, but it sent out the wrong message. So, and we'll go through that. You'll see that as we're going through it. So we're going to have a look at the 4 constituent groups that make up the Board of Management, and we're going to explore the individual roles. So who's on the Board of Management? Well, first of all, you will, I think for the purposes of the webinar, we decided that we're going to focus on schools that have more than one teacher. So when we're talking about boards, we'll be talking about 8-member boards. So Bishop Green, as leader of the Catholic community in the diocese, is the patron of your school and has ultimate responsibility for it. And the patron appoints 2 nominees to the Board of Management. And as a direct appointee of the patron, the authority of the chairperson derives from this appointment. So there are 2 direct appointees of the patron. Then you've got the school principal, or the acting principal will always be a member of the Board of Management. And from the same constituent group, and you'll see from the colour coding on it, you've got the teacher nominee who's elected by the teaching staff. So even though they're elected by the teaching staff, they do not represent the teaching staff at board level. And this is really important. The role of the teacher is to bring a teacher's view or a teacher's perspective to any discussion at board level. So again, they won't be taking instruction from the other teachers, but when there is a board discussion about any particular issue, the teacher nominee's role is to bring a teacher's perspective to it. So a staff issue should be brought to the principal in the first instance, and it's not the role of the teacher to raise any issue with the board on behalf of the teaching staff. And I think that was one of the questions that was submitted. What exactly is a teacher's role? So I hope that is clear now. You're a nominee bringing a teacher's perspective. So then we've got a mother's nominee and a father's nominee. And as with the teacher nominee, the mother's nominee and father's nominee do not represent the parent body. And I think when the elections for parent nominees happen at the beginning of the term of a board of office, a lot of parents don't want to get involved because they feel that they have to represent parents. They don't. They're not representative of the parent body, but they're nominated by the parent body on the board. So they bring a mother's perspective and a father's view as well to board deliberations. So a clear understanding, and it's something you might have to revisit. People might be aware of this at the beginning of the term of office of the board, but practices might creep in over a period of time, or maybe parent nominees would have left because their child has left the school. So you might have new parent nominees. So the message needs to be revisited again, just so they make sure, and to give them the assurance that they don't have to speak for all parents. And then you have the 2 community nominees who were nominated by the first 6 nominees to complete the 8 members of the Board of Management. So even though the individual members of the board are appointed through different procedures, they must now act collectively to manage the school on behalf of the patron. So what is my contribution? What is your contribution as a board member? I don't have the breakdown of attendees, so I don't know how many of you come from the different constituent groups, but I have to say that from my time in dealing with the principals and chairpersons in Cloyne, I do recognise some of the names from the registration list. But no matter who you are, what is your contribution to the board? So time, I suppose, is a great contribution. You're giving your time freely. We've got board members in over 2,800 Catholic schools who are giving their time freely, and then they bring their experience, and that's whether it's their life experience or their professional experience. Doesn't matter what, what constituent group you come from, you bring whatever experience that you have. As a parent, maybe somebody from the business world, they might have a dual role there, they might bring additional experience. But no matter what, your contribution is a valued contribution, and it should be acknowledged at local level, and it should be used. And we're going to talk a little bit later on about how the experience of the board can be used and how everybody has a part to play. And as well as bringing your experience, you're also bringing a commitment to the school, because we often find that, particularly with community nominees, many of them are people who've had an involvement with the school in the past under a different category, and they are committed to the school. And that is to be acknowledged, I think, for everybody who's attending here tonight, undertaking training to make sure that you are fulfilling your role as a board member. So again, your opinions and ideas are valued and should be valued, and they are welcomed. But and members who've served in a previous term of the Board of Management will bring their own experience to bear on the new term. But it's also important to recognise that new members bring fresh ideas, new thinking, and new experiences. So in terms of the roles of the board in the Board of Management, so we're going to look first of all at the official roles, and these roles are set out in the governance manual. And again, just to remind you that our recorded webinar on roles and responsibilities explores this in much greater detail. So as referenced already, the chairperson is a direct appointee of the patron, and section 10 of the governance manual for primary schools sets out the role of the chair. Now, CPSMA has also published a guide for chairpersons of boards of management in Catholic schools, a copy of which was sent to all our member schools, but it's also available on the CPSMA app. So that's specifically for our chairpersons. And again, just to say that currently our organisation is undertaking a survey of chairpersons to ascertain how best we can support them in their important role. So I would urge all chairs to complete the survey so that we can respond to those needs. We won't know unless you share it with us. So we do have a lot of contact from chairpersons, but we'd welcome more contact. So again, we're there to support the chairs of the board, as well as obviously the full board. The principal is the leader of learning and is responsible for the day-to-day management of the school, and the principal is accountable to the board for that management. And the only circular that sets out the responsibilities and duties of a principal teacher is circular 16 of 73. It's a very old circular, and it has been superseded in different parts, with different circulars, but it's still valid, and there are still sections of it that haven't been superseded. So it's important to be aware of that. And in the majority of cases, it's the principal who acts as secretary to the Board of Management. That's our experience of it, that principals will undertake that role. However, if a principal doesn't want to undertake that role, there is provision for a recording secretary to the board. And the duty of the recording secretary they're limited to keep setting the agenda in consultation with the chairperson and principal, keeping minutes in an appropriate form, retained in a safe place, recording the minutes, decisions made, etc. So that's the recording secretary when the principal isn't secretary to the board. And the last official role that you see on your screen there is the treasurer. And the board elects a treasurer from amongst its members, and the chairperson, principal or teacher nominee are precluded from being the treasurer. And of course, at the very first board meeting, you have the other 5 members of the board fighting tooth and nail to get that role of the treasurer. But the treasurer's role is a very important one, and I think there are a lot of supports there now in terms of the FSSU. But again, we'll be referring to that in a different webinar. We'll direct you to that. Then I suppose the other tasks that may be delegated, and I think this is something that sometimes people forget, that you've got board members who are willing to take on some additional tasks. So there are some tasks that may be delegated to board members according to their interests and their available time. So examples of these types of tasks could be maybe the appointment of a safety officer, who would have responsibility for reviewing the Board of Management's health and safety statement. Other tasks could include the maintenance of appropriate security and fire alarm systems. And again, these are just jobs that can be done in between board meetings, but subject to the authority of the board. It's not that you'd have anybody going on a solo run. It'd be somebody who would take on specific tasks. Again, coordinating a list of out-of-hours key holders for the school in the event of an alarm activation or access required for repairs and maintenance. So again, getting involved in research for the board, that's something that can be delegated, or that could be shared as well. And tasks can be delegated, as I say, without undermining the responsibility that's attached to the official roles that you can see there on your screens. So the Board of Management and the patron. So while the patron may delegate much of the responsibility for running the school to the Board of Management, the board must consult with the patron on a number of specific issues. And we're going to have a look at those now. So first of all, the patron appoints independent assessors for recruitment processes and also sanctions the appointments of teachers, including principal and externally appointed deputy principals and SNAs. So that recruitment piece, there must be an independent assessor who's nominated by the patron. So you'll be contacting Dan in relation to that to make sure that you have a person who's approved by the patron. Secondly, the patron should be consulted on any issue at all that relates to the school building, that is in relation to an extension or an additional accommodation, all major renovations or alterations of the grounds, the use of premises by other groups, amalgamations of schools. All of those are patron issues, so the patron must be consulted on all of those issues. Now, there is a very useful guidance from the department, guidelines on the use of school buildings outside of school hours. Again, we'll send you a link to that when we send out the other material. And it's a really useful resource when boards are approached in relation to the use of the school premises. But the board must contact the diocese in relation to a licensing requirement. So that's really, really important. Then the board has a statutory obligation to uphold and be accountable to the patron for so upholding the characteristic spirit of the school. That's an extract from the Education Act. So the diocesan advisor for primary religious education supports religious education in primary schools through a range of activities, including the delivery of in-service for teachers, as well as school visits to advise and support teachers regarding the Grow in Love programme. So it's also important, and we would recommend that the school ethos is included as an agenda item at board meetings. Keep it on the agenda, include it whatever stage of the school year, and it will follow I suppose the liturgical year in many ways as well, but to keep it on the agenda. Then the patron is entitled to request any or all of the following policies or documents: the child safeguarding statement, the original of which would have been sent to the patron; the admissions policy, which was reviewed in 2020 and sent to the patron for approval; the code of behaviour, anti-bullying policy, or indeed any element of the school plan. So the patron may also request minutes of Board of Management meetings. The school is required to submit its annual accounts to the Financial Support Services Unit, the FSSU. We'll mention that as well at a later stage. And that is a requirement. The second set of accounts will be sent in this year. But notwithstanding that, the patron is entitled to request school accounts at any stage. The patron will also receive a copy of the school's whole school evaluation and copies of other evaluations carried out by the inspectorate. And the patron, with the minister's consent, may remove a member of the Board of Management or dissolve a board in accordance with Section 16 of the Education Act. Just to be mindful of that, it's not used very often, but that provision is there, and that's all set out in the Education Act. So I'm going to hand you over to Miriam now, and Miriam is going to explore the concept of the board as a body corporate.
Thank you very much, Noreen, and good evening, everyone. So I'm going to begin this evening by setting out what is meant by a body corporate. So if we were to look at the legal definition of a body corporate, it is a succession or a collection of persons having, in the estimation of the law, an existence and rights and duties separate from those of the persons who form it from time to time. So when we speak about a board of management being a body corporate, it is a group of persons that acts as an entity, a body. The members of the board may change from time to time, but it is still the same board. So that means that a decision of a previous board is binding on the current board. And of course, decisions can be reviewed, but a newly formed board cannot refuse to honor decisions of the previous board. And technically and legally, there's no new board. The board is permanent as a corporate entity, but the members may change. So one of the questions that was submitted in advance of tonight's webinar was, how can board members be assured that they are not exposed to any personal liability? Well, Section 14 of the Education Act indemnifies the board and the members of the board for any claims made against them. The Alliance Custodian School Protection Policy, that's the insurance policy for Catholic schools, covers the individual members of the board and the board as a corporate body from any such claims. It is important to remember that this cover applies providing that the board members are acting in good faith, and that means informed good faith, in accordance with the governance manual, legislation, or department circulars, for example. So, confidentiality. This is an extremely important extract from the governance manual, and it emphasises that board members, as Noreen said, do not take instruction from the group that was elected. Noreen went through that earlier. But in relation to confidentiality, I suppose as a rule of thumb, it is that everything discussed at a board meeting is completely confidential. At the end of the board meeting, the board will decide what may be reported and by whom. This could be included then in the agreed report, which is designed to support good communication to parents, staff, and the school community. Another important point to make is that decisions that are made by the board, whether by consensus or vote, are decisions of the board as a body corporate. If an individual member of the board is opposed to such a decision, they must accept the board's decision and not publicly criticise or make any negative comment about it, irrespective of their own personal views on the matter. So I mentioned the agreed report. Well, it should not include details of any issues which must remain confidential to the board members. But it can be included in a school newsletter or other communication to parents, and schools might decide to publish it on their school website. You can see a sample of an agreed report on the CPSMA website. Good systems of communication are very important for engaging with the whole school community, parents, teachers, and pupils, all in a way that each group can understand. If this past year has proven anything, it's how important effective communication is. It's important that the board has developed good structures for communicating with all of the partners in the school community, and that way you'll avoid misunderstandings or misinformation. And when a board is implementing changes, there should be clear channels of communication, and that avoids confusion and mixed messages. Now, if we look specifically at communication with the Parents Association, it's very important in the interest of successful partnership that there would be agreed protocols and procedures put in place, and that will ensure that the communication is effective. I know in my own school, we had a liaison person who represented the Parents Association who I would have met with on a regular basis. We often get quite a few questions into the office with regard to fundraising. Now, fundraising in the name of the school must have prior consent of the board, regardless of who is driving the event. Good practice would be that the Parents Association would submit a list of fundraising ventures to the Board of Management at the beginning of the school year. Details for the fundraising events could include what the type of event is planned, when, what the purpose is, what the duration might be. Perhaps there'll be an agreed target, whether or not a Garda permit would be required, and then, of course, the timeline for the transfer of the funds to the Board of Management account. Now, it would be important that any of these decisions would be minuted by the Board of Management, but also by the Parents Association at their meeting. Any requests outside of this agreed list could be dealt with in an exceptional basis, and that would allow for good pre-planning around funding. The expenditure of the funds is by the board in consultation with the Parents Association, and this provision is detailed in the governance manual. So the school is a registered charity. Under the Charities Act of 2009, there is a requirement for each Board of Management to have its school registered with the Charities Regulator and to verify that information once a year. As part of that registration process, the Board of Management members, who are charity trustees, are required to provide their name, their start date on the board, and their residential address. Now, the residential address provided will not be made public on the register, and boards are also required to indicate which board member is the chairperson. The Charities Regulator has advised the Department of Education that boards of management that comply with the provisions of the Governance Manual for Primary Schools also meet the requirements set out by the regulator in the Charities Governance Code. So, with regard to finance, a board of management, as Noreen has already mentioned, is accountable to the patron in relation to the management of school accounts. So the patron is entitled to request a copy of the accounts, and it's important that the school would ensure that they fulfill any specific requirements of their patron in relation to the submission of annual accounts. Now, many of the queries we would have received in the past would have been in relation to whether school accounts should be certified or audited. And this question has become somewhat redundant since February 2020, as Noreen mentioned. Now schools are required to submit their annual school accounts to the FSSU. The format of this submission, which is referred to as the compilation of accounts, is agreed between the department and the FSSU, and it fulfills the board's obligation under Section 18. It also fulfills the board's obligation as a charity. Submitting the annual accounts to the FSSU fulfills its obligations in terms of the charity's accounts. So staying with finance, one of your queries related to the spending of school grants. As a general rule of thumb, funding is provided for specific purposes and must be used only for the purpose for which it was granted. Now, on our website, we have a list of grants payable for the 2020-21 school year, and it includes the specific purpose for each grant and the Department of Education circular that governs each grant and outlines how the monies can be spent. The list also includes information on the additional COVID payments for enhanced cleaning and purchase of sanitizer and PPE, etc. On the screen, we have a summary of the annual grants. So the first one there is the capitation grant. It's there to cover the day-to-day running of the school. So heating, lighting, insurance and upkeep. And the amount for each school year is based on enrolments on the 30th of September in the year preceding the grant payment. Then we have the ancillary grant, which covers the pay for secretarial and caretakers for schools. And just to note that the capitation grant and the ancillary services grant can be treated as a common grant. So there's a degree of flexibility in the combined use of the two grants. Then we have the school book grant. It issues to all schools, providing an annual amount per pupil towards the operation and maintenance of a school book rental scheme. Then we have the standardized testing grant. It's usually issued in April each year, but because schools were closed last year and there was no standardized testing, it wasn't issued last year. The minor works grant issues to all schools for physical infrastructure or furniture or equipment. The ICT grant, which is paid over a 5-year period as part of the digital strategy for schools. And then you have the assistive technology grant scheme for pupils with specific learning difficulties, and it's paid by the special education section. Other grants then could include capital grants for school accommodation or emergency works, disadvantaged schemes such as the DESH scheme and the school meal scheme, and school transport. We'll send a link to the grant calendar to all attendees, and we'll also send a link to the CPSMA webinar on school finances that was broadcast in December of last year. Now I'm going to hand you back to Noreen, who's going to go through a number of points in relation to board meetings.
That's great, Miriam. Thanks very much. So a reminder that our third webinar, the ones that I showed you at the top of the presentation, it deals solely with the operation of a board meeting. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of points that can give rise to difficulty. So first of all, disclosure of interests. It's addressed in section 15 of the governance manual, and a board member is required to declare if he or she is related to or connected with a company that's before the board for consideration supplying goods to the school. An example of this would be where a board is undertaking some minor works and a member of the board is connected to a company that's tendering for the work. So all they have to do is declare their interest, but it's important that they do, and then it's up to the board to decide whether or not it's going to be a conflict of interest. The second one is where a board member stands in a relationship to an applicant for a job. In this case, we're not just referring to a family relationship, but any relationship that could be deemed prejudicial to a decision-making process. And finally, if any member is personally the subject of a matter that's before the board for consideration. For example, if there was a parental complaint, then if the parent was a parent nominee on the board, they'd have to step aside while that was being discussed. Or let's say if there was a teacher was making an application for a career break and the decision was going to be discussed and made at the board meeting, then the teacher nominee would have to step away. So again, it's just making sure that you're not conflicted in any way, and just to be mindful of the fact that a professional relationship in itself doesn't necessarily mean that there's a conflict of interest. So I think the key message from this slide is that a board member should disclose the interest and let the board decide, consider it and decide whether or not their presence at that part of the meeting will be prejudicial to the decision making. So I've moved on to correspondence. I think this slideshow has taken on a life of its own, so I may have to go back on it if it moves too quickly. So just in relation to correspondence, the chairperson of the Board of Management is correspondent to the board, and correspondence can only be brought to the board via the chairperson. In some circumstances, the chair can nominate the principal to act as correspondent, but that doesn't change the chair's role as correspondent. So if a member of the board, and this is very often members are blindsided when they're approached out in the community and they're asked to bring an issue to the Board of Management, either verbally or written, they should be able, or you should be able as a board member to say, I'm sorry, that's not the appropriate protocol. All correspondence must go through the chairperson. and this is who the chairperson is. So it's important to have that answer ready just in case you are blindsided. Again, correspondence will, not all items have to be discussed. Some of them just need to be noted. But some may require discussion and a board response. And it's important not to include correspondence that breaches any procedure in terms of due process. So let's say there is a parental complaint and it's sent in. Somebody decides, no, I'm actually going to go straight to the chairperson with this. So the complaint goes straight to the chairperson, then the chairperson will know that that cannot be brought to the board until all earlier stages of the parental complaints procedure have been exhausted. So it could actually prejudice the outcome of a complaint. So you can say, you know, we have received a complaint, but it's going through the procedures. You wouldn't give any further information on that. So just be careful that it doesn't breach any procedure, whether it's a parental complaint or a disciplinary procedure in relation to a staff member. You would also include all department circulars that have been published since the previous meeting. You could give a list of those. Anonymous letters. Well, in terms of anonymous letters, and chairpersons do get quite a number of them, they're to be disregarded. The only exceptions that should be made in relation to anonymous letters are, firstly, if it's in relation to an allegation of bullying. But even at that, it shouldn't be brought to the board. So it can be noted there has been an anonymous letter in relation to bullying, but it's going to be dealt with through the anti-bullying procedures. There's a procedure there for that. So it doesn't go to the board unless it has to at a later stage. Similarly with child protection, if there's an anonymous child protection allegation made, that cannot be ignored. But it doesn't go to the board, but it will be noted at the board meeting that an anonymous letter has been received, a child protection allegation, and it's been referred to TUSLA. So it has to go through the procedures. So just because it was written directly to the board, it shouldn't be discussed at the board. It's the child protection procedures that will kick in there. So just to be mindful of that. And then in relation to a solicitor's letter, we would advise that if you get a letter from a solicitor, if the board gets a letter from a solicitor to seek legal advice, just contact Allianz. Allianz is the insurers for all Catholic schools, and just bring it to their attention before any response is issued. So that's just a general piece around correspondence, but correspondence does give rise to a lot of difficulties. So that's why we're picking that out of that particular section of the webinar on board meetings. That's correspondence. The Child Protection Oversight Report, again, records provided under the Child Protection Oversight Report are to be reviewed solely for the purposes of oversight of the reporting requirements set out in the Child Protection Procedures, and that's Chapter 9. Now, again, we have a recorded webinar. It was broadcast last Thursday, so if you didn't get an opportunity to tune into that one, we had a great attendance, almost 1,000 board members at it. It will be available on our website from tomorrow. Hopefully tomorrow afternoon we'll have that. So under no circumstances should board members enter into any discussion when the Child Protection Oversight Report is being presented. It's purely to confirm that the documents are there to back up the procedures. So there's no investigation. Again, this is jumping away on me, apologies. So the purpose of the review is solely to review whether, based on the information available to the designated liaison person, usually the principal, and any TUSLA advice available, that the relevant reporting procedures and requirements were followed. On that one. Okay, just a couple of questions. I'll just start off with this one, just a few FAQs at the end, ones that you sent in to us. The Child Protection Oversight Report, what should we do during the course of the pandemic? Should it still be presented? And the advice from the department is the Child Protection Oversight Reports do not apply to board meetings that are held remotely, for obvious reasons. If the whole purpose of a Child Protection Oversight Report is to confirm that the documents exist, that's the only purpose of it, and that the reporting procedures were adhered to, it's too risky to share documents, even though many of them will be redacted, but to share documents remotely like that. So the Child Protection Oversight Report should not be given at a remote meeting. The only exception is where there is nothing to report, because you have no oversight, there's no sharing of documents. So you can have a Child Protection Oversight Report if there are no reports to be made. I hope that one is clear. Then in relation to there will still need to be a face-to-face meeting once a term for the purposes of child protection oversight. And it should be only for child protection oversight purposes only. So it will be limited to that. So I think I may have skipped a slide there. I'm going to go back to that. Miriam, do you want to come in on that one?
That's okay. I think you've more or less covered it. It just can face-to-face board meetings resume now that schools have fully reopened. The advice around that one is that they only for the purposes which Noreen has already outlined, for the purpose of the Child Protection Oversight Report. But other than that, it is expected and advised that schools would actually continue to have their meetings remotely until such time as the advice changes on that. So it's remote only unless needed for the purposes of the Child Protection Oversight Report.
That's great, Miriam. And another query that came in was in relation to what is the role of the board in between meetings? And I suppose just to be mindful of the fact that board business can only be discussed when the board is in session. And then the principal will implement the decisions of the board. So officers of the board will have certain tasks to complete in between meetings. For example, the treasurer and, preparing the report for the formal meeting. And between Board of Management meetings, sometimes decisions may have to be taken by the chairperson and the principal, that you wouldn't be convening a full board meeting for a particular reason. So an executive decision, I suppose, would be made by the chairperson and the principal, and then that would be reported at the next board meeting. But in advance of a meeting, we would always recommend that obviously the agenda is going to be sent out, and it wouldn't have any detail in it, just the order of the agenda that's going to be discussed at the board meeting. And you may be sent some documentation, maybe policy documents to review, but no other board correspondence should be shared outside of a board meeting. And Miriam has the very last question, and this is the burning question from
the
our principal.
$1 million question.
It is, yeah. And that's why I'm delighted to hand it over to you, Miriam.
Oh, thanks, Noreen. Thank you, Noreen. So I suppose, look, this is a question we're getting frequently, and there's no easy answer to this one, I'm afraid. Now, what I would say to you is, if a school is faced with the lack of substitutes, in the first instance, we would urge you to go down through the checklist. If you go to Circular 44, 2020, section 5.4, and as Noreen said, this will be included on your list. It sets out the sequencing of access to substitution, and it would be important that you would record your actions within that sequencing. And then, as well as that, then at the beginning of the year in September, the department issued Information Note 005 of 2020 around where you have people who are job sharing. They're now permitting subbing where people are job sharing, where that would not have been previously allowed. Information Note 7 of 2020 lifted the restrictions on career break subbing as well. So they may be just points of information. But if the school still cannot locate a substitute, we would urge you to contact the department on the principal's helpline. And again, that number and email address will be included in the information that we're going to send to you afterwards. And if it's out of hours, it would be on that email under that principal's helpline. And this applies to both cases where classes are being sent home and school closures. That's where a substitute cannot be found. So I'm afraid there's no easy answer on that one. But, again, if people call us, we can also engage with the department on their behalf. But the department would ask that you would call the principal's helpline. Okay.
That's great, Miriam. Thanks for that. And I suppose well, the slideshow was running away with us there. So you've seen this screenshot already. That's just to direct you to the CPSMA app. We've referenced it a couple of times during the presentation. The chairperson's handbook is on that. You get updates as well. Anything that comes out directly to the boards by email will also be put on the app, and you'll have access to our newsletters as well. And finally, just a reminder of our contact details, that our CPSMA advisors are available from 9 to 5 weekdays to answer queries from chairpersons and principals and to support you in whatever way we can. And you have the contact details there. And again, I would encourage particularly our chairpersons to reach out to us, because I know our principals have a lot of support in terms of their union and in terms of their professional organization as well. But we're there for the chairpersons, and we would urge you to use our services as much and as often as you need it. So I'm going to hand back to you, Dan.
Thank you very much, both of you. Did very, very well. And to quote, very informative. Where can I get the recording of this session? I think that will become available on you will be sending that out, isn't that correct?
That's right.
Yeah, okay. So, and definitely I'd agree with that. Very informative, and I think I'm very, very pleased. There are a couple of questions that have come in. How is the board the employer if the terms and conditions of employment are set out by the department?
Is somebody sending us in very difficult questions
Isn't
after
it?
all the time we gave to Cloyne this evening?
Is it past the time?
Not at all. No. We'll stay as long as you'll stay with us. No, that's the department is the paymaster, and the department will set out the terms and conditions and will liaise with the unions, etc. Obviously, different unions for the different category of employee. But the board, and whenever the terms and conditions of a circular in relation to teachers or in relation to SNAs are involved, then the employer is represented. Like the CPSMA would have a seat at the table there. So there is consultation. But that's the relationship. But the relationship with the board is employee-employer, and the department is the paymaster. But the contract of employment is with the Board of Management.
Right, thank you, Noreen. The next one, if the recording secretary is someone, this is an interesting question. If the recording secretary is someone other than the principal, who gets paid the secretary's allowance? Yeah,
that's an interesting one. I hope I'll remember the Miriam. You might remember the number of the circular offhand. Anyway, look, yes, I think there was, there was a payment to principals. It was only made available to principals who acted as secretary to the Board of Management. So it was introduced, I think, off the top of my head, maybe 2009, and it was short-lived because we went into a period of hard times. So yes, that was withdrawn. Right. But anybody who had, any principal who was a secretary to the Board of Management at that particular time was paid that allowance. But anybody who came into the system after 2012, they weren't eligible for that. So once you had it, you didn't lose it, but it's no longer available. And it's only payable to the principal who acts as secretary to the board, not to a recording secretary.
The next one is, if staff members are absent from school, do they have to notify the chairperson of the Board of Management and give a reason for their absence, as well as notifying the principal?
That very much depends on this. Sorry, Noreen. That
no,
very
much
ahead, depends on the school culture as such. Obviously, it would be extremely important that they would, in the first instance, notify the principal, because it's the day-to-day manager, and they would need to be able to source a substitute or make provision for the children. With regard to the chairperson, I mean, that kind of practice varies. Wouldn't you agree, Noreen? From school to school, it wouldn't be the usual practice as such. It wouldn't be unheard of at the same time, but it wouldn't be, you know, the practice, as I say, in every school.
Yeah, and I suppose the other thing there is that there is a requirement to give a report to the Board of Management on
That's
the
right.
number of the names of the substitutes that were employed. So all of that does come to the attention of the board, but who's going to deal with the absence of the teacher? Who's required to source the substitute? So it will be the principal, I would agree, in the main, who would be contacted. Obviously, the chairperson will be advised of any absences and any substitutes, etc.
Okay. Our school, I think this was answered. Are schools obliged to file accounts with the charity regulator as well as the FSSU?
No,
Yeah,
it's not,
but
once it's sent into the FSSU, and this we're
That's it,
after
fulfills
the
that
second year, it
requirement, yeah.
satisfies it.
I
Yeah.
think that was answered earlier.
I
What?
think sorry, Dan, I think I saw one there about the types of remote meetings
That's
allowed.
right. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, if you will see on the CPSMA website in the COVID section, it actually sets out, and it's also there it's on the website. It just sets out some general guidance around all of that, around the setting up and running of remote meetings for boards of management. So you'll get that information there on the CPSMA website.
Right. Thank you, Miriam. Any advice on how to arrange for transfer, an interesting question, to transfer of fundraising money from Parents Association to the board when the relationship is strained?
Oh, well, now we could spend all night at that, couldn't we? Because the difficulty is the strain in relationship.
Exactly.
And that doesn't mend on its own. So I think it's a bigger question there, Dan, really, on building relationships.
Yeah, I completely agree with Noreen. I think that you need to start with building that line of communication, building that that, as I said earlier, in my own school, we had a liaison person. I wasn't able to meet with the chairperson because they worked during the day, but a liaison person was nominated who would come into myself, and you would slowly build a relationship there. And there are many different ways, and we can talk boards through specific strategies that we might have used, having heard their specific story and the specific set of circumstance, and we'd be able to support them with that. But it really is about starting to build a relationship with them. That's where it starts. Yeah.
Yes, I think so.
And I suppose just on that as well, Miriam, sorry, Dan, just there should be a conversation around how fundraising should be transferred. I mean, it's covered in the governance manual that there should be an agreed, I mean, you can use a webinar like this as the opportunity to say, look, we've had board training. We need now to maybe look at some of the practices and procedures and put some sort of protocols in place around the transfer, that it will be done within a certain period of time and so on.
Yes. Now, there are other questions there, and I think it might be wiser to, maybe stall here, and those questions, or if you want to continue.
If they're easy ones, will stay on the line, Dan.
Yeah,
Are there
okay.
easy ones there?
And if people wish to go away, that's fine.
No, please do. But and anybody who does want to leave, that's Miriam. Are you happy enough we'll have a look at them? If we have the answers,
I'm happy, yeah.
We'll share them. It's a nice conversation that we have going here now, so I wouldn't like to ruin it.
No,
but anybody who has to go, you're certainly that's fine. Let me see.
I see one there. Should the teacher's nominee record the minutes of the meeting if requested by the secretary? Again, that's Noreen did mention the role of a recording secretary if it's a thing that the secretary, sometimes it can be difficult if the principal is the secretary and they're trying to take the notes. So something like that could maybe be agreed beforehand, but certainly there is a role for a recording secretary on the board, isn't there, Noreen?
There is, yeah. I mean, it's a separate role. So this is it's the teacher nominee. I know it does happen in practice, but I think it's something that should be agreed. I mean, it is the responsibility of the principal as secretary to the board to take the minutes, etc. But I think, as Miriam says, when you're heavily involved in the board meeting, it can be difficult, so certainly they should be agreed. If notes are taken, then I think they should be agreed and signed off by the principal. as
Yeah.
well, obviously before they go to the board finally for sanction at the next meeting. Would
And
that
I
be
think-
fair enough comment on it?
Yeah. I think it's important as well to make a very clear distinction between that role and correspondence or secretary to the board. It is purely for recording.
The recording
minutes.
secretary,
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the principal as secretary to the board can take responsibility for some correspondence, as we
Yes.
said, with the permission of
Yeah.
the chair. Yeah.
Anything else there?
What is defined as remote meetings reverting to just group emails currently not ideal? And we would say, no, that's not ideal.
No, that's not ideal.
Even in terms, I know there was another one that I saw there around sharing the minutes of a meeting beforehand. Now, we would always say that they should be shared at the board meeting, because there is a danger of them going astray or sitting in somebody's inbox, or maybe a shared email address. I mean, that's another, we have a lot of advice on that on the board meetings, the webinars. So I don't want to take up too much time on that, but we have addressed that. But certainly group emails, wouldn't recommend it at all. No, wouldn't recommend it. It's just, it's too easy for them to, to be resent or accessed, or, but we have guidance around the use of email for board business again. So that is there.
I mean, the last thing you'd want to be facing is a data breach, and
That's
that
it.
can so easily happen, and minutes do contain some sensitive information. So I would be very, careful.
Yeah, absolutely. And that one around the minutes being shared beforehand, we would, like I've already said, there, it shouldn't happen, but minutes should be at a minimum anyway. We have, just to mention, I haven't mentioned it already, but we do have template minutes, agreed report, all of those. So what goes into the minutes really is a record of decision. No, Dan said this and Miriam said that. It's not a log of the narration, so you just have to be mindful of that. Is there anything that we missed?
The last one there, can you please say something about what should be included in the minutes? Oh, it's now. Apologies, that's not the one. There's one above that. The autonomy. The autonomy, do the chair? How much autonomy do the chairperson and the principal have to make decisions without having a board meeting?
Well, I suppose they have an executive role, not that it's written down anywhere, but I mean, as there may be decisions that need to be made straight away. And I think I did reference that during the course. A decision has to be made. You can't call a board meeting. The chairperson and the principal will make a decision, and it will be reported then at the next board meeting. So there is a certain amount of autonomy there. Certainly you can't delay an important decision being made to convene a board meeting. It's difficult enough to convene board meetings as it is, so where a board meeting can't be convened, and if it's an important decision that needs to be made, then the chairperson and the principal will make that executive decision. Like the whole idea is that, and that's the nature of the body corporate, that all decision making would be made by the board when the board is in session. In an ideal world, yes, but there are times when a decision has to be made, but then it would be reported back to the board at the next meeting.
Our chairperson doesn't want to call another remote meeting. As far as I know, there are a specific number of meetings to be held per year. Can we call a meeting without the chairpersons?
No, what I would say, rather than going into detail like that, without a full picture of, the way meetings have, I mean, the number of meetings and the regularity of the meetings is set out in the governance manual, and it's in the webinars as well. But it is up to the chair to convene the meeting. That is the chair's role. So I think if there's a difficulty around that, we do take calls from chairs and from principals. So rather than giving advice that without the full detail of it, so I would say that that's one for our advisors. Would you agree with that, Miriam?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Noreen.
just to get.
Yeah, because it can be difficult to kind of get to the core of the concern or the issue
Yeah.
without actually chatting through it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
I noticed
Somebody mentioned the liaison person. I just mentioned that because
Yes.
it suited the situation that I was in. It just meant that there was a link, because oftentimes parents are busy people and can be working parents, and it can be difficult for them to be able to link in with the principal or the school. And I just found it was a great way of having that link, that connection. Other things that we would have done in my own school would have been where so 3 members, the executive, usually the chairperson, the treasurer, and the principal, say, on the board, would have met with members of the Parents Association just to have a chat or to talk through not necessarily issues, but to kind of just, anything that we may have had an agreed report, we could share planning for fundraising, that sort of thing, that you can meet with your Parents Association on. So it's not about your liaison, this is what you're going to do. It's about communication. It's about linking with the Parents Association. It's about having that two-way conversation, and whatever way that works for your school, that works for your school,
And just to remember that the parent nominees on the Board of Management are entitled to be a member of the Parents Association Committee. They're ex officio members of the Parents Association Committee.
The question above that one, Miriam, advice to parents representatives. Sorry, advice to parents, any advice to parents representatives on bringing concerns from community in relation to teachers rep or principal or chairperson of
well,
board.
I think Noreen addressed that.
Yeah, I think we covered. Yeah, I think we covered that. Just no, you're fine.
No, yeah,
it's just if the question has been asked again, then I think we need to answer it.
Exactly.
So if there's a concern, the chairperson is still correspondent to the board in terms of anything that comes before the board, because it may not be appropriate to bring something to the board. Okay, so if there's a concern, then it should be, when you look at the webinar on the running of a board meeting, you'll see how we address any other business and how how members of the board can bring concerns to the attention of the chairperson to determine whether it's appropriate or not to discuss it at board level. So
I presume what they mean from the community here is maybe the school community.
Right.
And it says representatives on bringing concerns from the community in relation to teachers rep or principal. So there are procedures to deal with concerns or issues. There's a parental complaints procedure. There are, and often schools would have communication policies where, if there's an issue that they want discussed at school level, but normally that's what happens, that it would maybe fall into one of those procedures. Again, if you have a specific concern, if you call us, we can actually talk you through your specific the situation that you find yourself in. But normally, you see, as Noreen mentioned earlier, it's not really advise that a parent, say a parents rep or a community rep, would listen to an issue and then bring it to a board. That isn't the proper channel of communication with the board, and it's not really advised.
Yeah, no, that's it. I'm just.
If an emergency decision made by the chairperson and principal, can this be overruled by the board afterwards?
Well, I think we're getting into a space now, where you need, I mean, the day-to-day running of the school, as we've already said in the course of the webinar, that's the role of the principal, and the chair is accountable for the effective management of the board, is accountable to the patron on that. So there are sort of executive roles there. So a decision that's made that may have to, had to be made between board meetings, and it'll be reported at the next one. Then if there's to be any change on it, it's there for discussion or whatever, it's very hard to advise on this particular one. I think it has to be dealt with.
Terms,
You couldn't address it in general terms, but again, I think we've got the channels explored well enough in it, and it's Yeah, I think we've covered it. I wouldn't say any more in a general webinar on that one.
Yeah, that's
Dan,
right.
Miriam, would you agree with that?
I absolutely agree, and
Yeah.
I'd welcome a call if anyone wants to chat to me, because
That's
I,
it.
as Noreen and Dan mentioned, I actually am the person who you'll usually be put through to. So now you have a face. I have no faces. That's the disadvantage of not meeting people in person.
So I think maybe, is there anything else that you see there?
Can't see anything.
No, I think I've just
The
scrolled down
charities
through them
regulator
there.
one, I think, has been answered.
Yeah, the submission to the charities, we've
Yeah.
covered that. No, I think we've
that's
covered it.
covered. Okay.
I have to
So
say I enjoyed that session, being able to, and
it is
thanks
nice
Dan,
because
thanks Dan for
it's one,
moderating that section of it. I
it's
sprung
one of
that one on Dan at, sorry Dan, I sprung it on Dan at the beginning of the webinar.
it's one of the things you miss at Zoom meetings as well. You know, it's very hard to get that kind of interaction. I suppose chat is as good as it gets.
Yeah.
So listen, you two, I just want to thank you very, very much for being with us here tonight, and very much appreciate you giving the time, and a lot of time went into the preparation of the webinar. And indeed, I thank you both for all the help and support you give to the principals and chairpersons in Cloyne, and indeed throughout the country. So, but in Cloyne, I suppose, in specific, to be specific, and I would like to thank all the people who attended, the nominees to the boards that were with us here tonight. And as you said, thank you all for your time, your experience, your commitment, and your opinions and ideas, and your questions, your queries. So thank you all very, very much for being with us tonight. And thank you both again to Noreen and to Miriam, Cordemelia Margaret and Slán.
Our pleasure, Fáilte.
Right. Okay.
Slán.
Slán Tamil.
Thanks all.